Hello, I'm the Archivist, and welcome back to the Library of Human Stories. We often believe that we know the people closest to us, our friends, our family, our partners. We build our lives around them, trusting in the face they show to the world and to us. But sometimes, behind the most loving smile and the most caring eyes, a darkness can be growing, a meticulously crafted lie that remains invisible until it's far too late. Today's story is about one such case. It's about a perfect marriage, a perfect life, and a disappearance that baffled a community. It's a story that seemed to have no clues and no answers until investigators looked in the one place where our modern secrets are kept, a simple search bar. And what they found there wasn't just a clue. It was a roadmap to an evil so cold and calculated, it would haunt them for the rest of their careers. This is the story of Sarah and Mark Jenkins, and the digital ghost that exposed a monster. In the quiet, tree-lined suburb of Maple Creek, the Jenkins home was something of a local landmark, not for its history but for its perfection. The lawn was always immaculate, the seasonal decorations were always tasteful, and the warm glow from the windows seemed to promise a life of domestic bliss. Mark and Sarah Jenkins were the couple everyone looked up to. Sarah was a brilliant graphic designer, a free spirit whose laughter was infectious. She ran her own successful freelance business from a sunlit studio in their home, and her work was sought after by clients across the country. She was the heart of their social circle, the one who organized potlucks and remembered everyone's birthday. Mark was her perfect counterpart. He was a handsome, charismatic architect, a man who seemed to adore the ground his wife walked on. He was thoughtful, attentive, and publicly. He never missed an opportunity to praise Sarah's talent and spirit. To their friends, they weren't just a happy couple. They were the blueprint for a happy marriage. They had been married for 8 years, with no children, but a life rich with travel, friends, and shared dreams. But on the morning of Tuesday, October 12th, the idyllic picture of their life was shattered. Mark Jenkins called 911, his voice choked with panic. Sarah was gone. He told the dispatcher he'd woken up at his usual time, around 6:30, to find the other side of the bed empty and cold. He assumed she'd gotten up early to work on a deadline, something she often did. But when he went downstairs, he found the house unnervingly still. Her car, a silver sedan she loved, was in the garage. Her purse was on the kitchen counter, right where she always left it. Her keys were in the small ceramic bowl by the door. Most disturbingly, her phone was on the nightstand, plugged into its charger, displaying a screen full of unread notifications. In our modern world, leaving without your phone is like leaving without a part of yourself. For Sarah, who ran her business from that device, it was unthinkable. When the first officers arrived, they found Mark pacing the living room, a picture of pure distress. He explained their routine. They'd had a quiet dinner the night before, watched a movie, and gone to bed around 10. He said everything was normal, completely and utterly normal. There was no argument, no tension, no sign of anything wrong. She had simply vanished into thin air. The police did a preliminary search of the house and the surrounding area. There were no signs of a break-in, no shattered windows, no forced locks. There were no signs of a struggle inside either. No overturned furniture, no objects out of place. The home was as perfect and orderly as it always was. It was a crime scene with no crime. Detective Miller was the lead investigator assigned to the case. He was a veteran of the force, a man with 2 decades of experience and a deep-seated skepticism for stories that were too neat, too clean. His younger partner, Detective Evans, was more tech-savvy, a digital native who understood that in the 21st century, a person's life story was written in data as much as it was in memories. As they walked through the Jenkins home, Miller felt a familiar, unsettling feeling in his gut. The absence of evidence was, in itself, a kind of evidence. People don't just evaporate. Something was profoundly wrong. Mark Jenkins was, on the surface, the model of a cooperative, grieving husband. He gave the detectives a detailed timeline of their previous day. He answered every question without hesitation. He provided a list of Sarah's friends and family, and photos for the missing person flyers. He seemed broken, lost, and desperate for any news. He told them, "She's my everything. I don't know what I'd do without her. We have to find her." His pain felt real. The community of Maple Creek certainly thought so. Friends and neighbors rallied around him, creating a makeshift command center in his living room, organizing search parties, and plastering flyers with Sarah's smiling face on every lamppost and shop window in town. The local news ran segments featuring Mark, his eyes red-rimmed, pleading for his wife's safe return. He was the tragic hero of a story no one could comprehend. But Detective Miller couldn't shake his unease. Mark's story was flawless, almost rehearsed. He used the right words, showed the right emotions, but there was a strange lack of spontaneity to his grief. It was as if he was playing a part he had practiced for. Miller and Evans began their interviews, starting with Sarah's closest friends. They all painted the same picture, a perfect couple, deeply in love. But good detectives know to ask the same questions in different ways. And slowly, tiny, almost invisible cracks began to appear in the facade of the perfect marriage. One friend, a woman named Chloe, hesitated when asked if anything had seemed off lately. Not really, she'd said initially. But later she called Miller back. She remembered a brunch with Sarah a few weeks prior. Sarah had been quieter than usual. Chloe had asked if everything was okay, and Sarah had just waved it off, saying she was stressed with work. But Chloe recalled a specific odd comment. Sarah had said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a beautiful house that Mark designed, but I didn't get to choose any of the furniture." It was a strange, metaphorical statement. At the time, Chloe had thought nothing of it. Now it sounded like a cry for help. Another friend mentioned that Mark, despite his easygoing nature, could be possessively jealous. He didn't like Sarah going on work trips alone, and would call and text her constantly when she was away. It was framed as him being caring and attentive, but looking back, the friend wondered if it was more about control. These were whispers, not evidence. They were feelings and interpretations, not facts. But they were enough to shift the detective's focus more squarely onto Mark Jenkins. A missing person case is always a potential homicide. And in most of those cases, the first person you look at is the spouse. The search for Sarah continued for days, then a week. The community search parties dwindled. The news cycle moved on. Hope began to fade, replaced by a grim sense of dread. Throughout it all, Mark continued to play the part of the heartbroken husband. But behind closed doors, detectives Miller and Evans were digging into the life he had so carefully concealed. Their first stop was the couple's finances. On the surface, things looked great. Mark's architecture firm was successful, and Sarah's design business was thriving. They lived in $1 million home and took expensive vacations. But Evans, an expert at following the money, started pulling on a few loose threads. He discovered that Mark's firm, while it had a good reputation, was struggling with cash flow. Mark had lost 2 major clients in the last year, a fact he had hidden from everyone, including, it seemed, his wife. To maintain their lavish lifestyle, he had taken out high-interest personal loans and was drowning in credit card debt. He was living a lie, projecting an image of success while his financial world was collapsing around him. And then came the discovery that set off every alarm bell in the precinct. Sarah Jenkins had a life insurance policy, a very substantial one. It was for $2 million, with her husband Mark as the sole beneficiary. The policy was new, taken out just 6 months before her disappearance. Motive. It was the oldest one in the book. A mountain of debt and a multi-million-dollar payout. It was a compelling theory, but it was still just a theory. They had no body, no weapon, no physical evidence linking Mark to Sarah's disappearance. They had a man who looked guilty on paper, but they couldn't prove a thing. Frustrated, Miller and Evans sat in their office, the whiteboard covered in notes, timelines, and questions with no answers. The physical world had offered them nothing. "So," Evans said, pointing to the board, "we go where the real evidence is. We go digital." They already had warrants for the couple's phones and laptops, which had been collected from the house on the first day. Sarah's devices were unremarkable. Emails with clients, texts with friends, social media posts full of life and creativity. Her last activity was a post on Instagram the night she vanished, a picture of the sunset with the caption, "Another beautiful day." Then they turned to Mark's devices. His laptop and phone seemed just as mundane. Work emails, articles about architecture, a fantasy football league chat. There was nothing incriminating. It was almost too clean, just like the house. But Evans knew that what a person deletes is often more revealing than what they keep. He started a deep dive, running forensic software to recover deleted files, browser caches, and search histories. For hours, the process yielded nothing of note. More sports scores, more news articles. Miller was beginning to think it was another dead end. And then Evans stopped. He stared at his screen, his expression changing from one of intense focus to one of disbelief. "Miller," he said, his voice low, "you need to see this." On the screen was a list, a recovered log of search queries from Mark's laptop, stretching back over the past 4 months. It wasn't just a list of searches. It was a timeline of a gathering darkness. It was a step-by-step guide to the destruction of a life. The first entries from 4 months ago were subtle, almost understandable for an insecure spouse. How to install a GPS tracker on a car without them knowing. Best spouse tracking apps for iPhone. Signs your wife is losing. Interest. Can you read someone's text messages? Remotely. This painted a picture of a man, consumed by jealousy and suspicion. He wasn't just worried. He was actively plotting to spy on his wife. The man who praised her in public was, in private, treating her like a suspect in his own paranoid investigation. The detective scrolled down. The searches from 3 months ago began to take a financial turn. How? To find out your spouse's net worth. Does my wife's business count as a marital asset? How much is $1 million life insurance policy? The jealousy was now mixing with greed. He wasn't just suspicious of her. He was sizing her up, calculating her value. The loving husband was taking inventory. Then, 2 months before Sarah disappeared, the searches took a chilling, decisive turn. The mask of a worried husband fell away completely, revealing the cold, calculating mind of a predator. Does life insurance pay out for a missing person? Legal waiting period to declare a missing spouse dead. How to get power of attorney for a missing person. He was no longer just thinking about a potential problem. He was actively researching how to profit from a tragedy. A tragedy that, it was now terrifyingly clear, he was planning to orchestrate himself. Detective Miller felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen a lot of terrible things in his career, but the methodical, passionless nature of this digital trail was something else. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a business plan, and it got worse, so much worse. The searches from the final month, the weeks and days leading up to Sarah's disappearance, were a descent into pure, unadulterated evil. They were the search history of a monster, tasteless, odorless household chemicals that are poisonous. How to induce a heart attack that looks natural. What is the lethal dose of potassium chloride do? Standard autopsies detect rare plant toxins. Mark wasn't just planning to make his wife disappear. He was researching how to murder her in a way that would evade detection, to make it look like a tragic accident or a sudden medical event. He was trying to write the perfect crime, and Google was his co-author. The detectives sat in stunned silence, the glow of the monitor illuminating the horrifying blueprint of a man's plan to erase his wife. Each search query was a footstep on a path leading directly to that quiet Tuesday morning when Sarah Jenkins ceased to exist. But as they scrolled through the final days of searches, they found the entries that truly defined the depth of his monstrosity. These weren't just about the act itself. They were about the performance. How to fake cry. Best acting techniques for showing. Grief. What to say to police as a grieving husband. How to pass a lie detector test. He had researched how to perform his role. The frantic 911 call, the tearful pleas on the news, the inconsolable grief he showed to friends and family. It was all a script. He had studied and rehearsed for the part of the heartbroken widower. The entire community's outpouring of sympathy was directed at a man who was not a victim, but the architect of the entire tragedy. The search history laid it all out. The motive, the means, the premeditation, and the cover-up. It was the most complete confession Miller had ever seen, and it was written before the crime was even committed. But there was one final set of searches, made in the hours just before he called 911, that revealed the ultimate twisted goal. It went beyond the money, beyond the jealousy. It showed a level of psychological cruelty that was almost incomprehensible. How to access a deceased spouse's business accounts. Transferring ownership of a sole proprietorship. And then, the most chilling search of all, how to delete and rebrand an Instagram portfolio. It finally clicked for Detective Miller. Mark wasn't just jealous of Sarah's life. He was jealous of her talent. He wasn't just in debt. He was overshadowed by his wife's success. Her freelance business, born from her own creativity and hard work, was thriving while his own legacy firm was failing. He didn't just want her money. He wanted her life. He wanted to absorb her success, to take credit for her creativity, to literally erase her and put his own name on her life's work. The plan wasn't just to kill her and collect the insurance. It was to steal her identity. Now they had it. The complete picture, the why. They knew what Mark had done, and they had the digital ghost of his own thoughts to prove it. The next step was the confrontation. They brought Mark Jenkins back to the station. He walked in with the same weary, grief-stricken expression he had worn for the past 2 weeks. He sat down across from Miller and Evans, sighing heavily, and asked if there was any news. "We have some questions for you, Mark," Miller began, his voice calm and even. He started by going over the timeline again, asking the same questions he'd asked a dozen times before. Mark answered patiently, his story unchanged, polished to a high shine. Miller leaned forward. "Mark, tell us about Sarah's health. Did she have any issues? Any heart problems?" A flicker of something, surprise, fear, crossed Mark's face before he masked it. "No," he said. "She was perfectly healthy. Why?" "Just covering all the bases," Miller said casually. "You know, sometimes things happen. A sudden aneurysm, a heart attack. People can seem fine one minute and be gone the next. You ever look into that kind of stuff?" Mark's jaw tightened. "I'm an architect detective, not a doctor." Evans slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a printout of a search query. Tasteless, odorless household chemicals that are poisonous. Mark stared at it. The color drained from his face. For the first time since the investigation began, the mask of the grieving husband slipped, revealing the cold, panicked man beneath. I don't know what that is," he stammered. "That's not mine." "Someone must have used my computer." Evans slid another sheet of paper over. "How to induce a heart attack that looks natural." And another. "How to fake cry." And another. "How to delete and rebrand an Instagram portfolio." Sheet after sheet, a cascade of his own dark thoughts, printed in black and white, piled up on the table in front of him. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. Mark's confident demeanor crumbled, replaced by a raw, cornered terror. His rehearsed lines were gone. His script was useless. He was left with nothing but the ugly truth of what he had done. His eyes darted between the two detectives. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable. It was his own mind, his own meticulous planning, laid bare for them to see. Miller leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "It's over, Mark. We know what you did. We know why you did it. The only question left is where she is. Where is Sarah?" For a long moment, Mark Jenkins just sat there, broken. The weight of his own calculated evil finally crushed him. The performance was over. And then he began to talk. The confession was as cold and methodical as the plan itself. He told them about his mounting debts and his searing professional jealousy. He resented Sarah's easy success, the way her talent seemed so effortless while he struggled to keep his legacy firm afloat. He began to see her not as his wife, but as a resource. An obstacle to be removed and an asset to be liquidated. On that final Monday night, he had mixed a lethal dose of a chemical he'd researched, a beta blocker he'd stolen from his own father's medicine cabinet, into her evening tea. It was a massive dose designed to stop her heart. He watched her drink it, sat next to her on the couch as she complained of feeling dizzy and tired. He helped her to bed, telling her she just needed to sleep it off. And then he waited. In the early hours of the morning, while the entire neighborhood slept, he confirmed she was gone. He wrapped her body in a builder's tarp from his garage. He then drove her car out to a remote section of a state park, a place he had scouted weeks earlier, a place he'd found by searching for best places to hide something in Maple Creek County. He left her car there to create a false trail, as if she had driven out there herself. Then he walked the 5 miles back home under the cover of darkness, arriving just before dawn. He showered, got dressed, and at 6:30, just as he told the police, he began his day. He made his frantic call to 911, and the greatest performance of his life began, but he made one crucial, arrogant mistake. He believed he was smart enough to plan the perfect crime, but he wasn't smart enough to understand that in the digital age, our thoughts leave fingerprints. He cleaned up the physical crime scene perfectly, but he left the crime scene of his mind wide open for investigators to explore. He believed that by deleting the history, he was deleting the thought. He was wrong. Based on his confession, police found Sarah's sedan abandoned where he'd left it. And with the information he provided, a search team was sent to the precise location he described, a desolate wooded ravine deep within the park. There, they found Sarah Jenkins. The vibrant, talented woman who was loved by so many had been reduced to a secret, discarded by the man who had vowed to protect her. The autopsy later confirmed the presence of the beta blocker in her system, at levels far beyond any therapeutic dose. It would have almost certainly been missed in a standard examination. Without his confession, and without the search history that prompted it, he might have gotten away with it. He might have waited a few years, had Sarah declared legally dead, collected the $2 million, taken over her business and started a new life, built on the ashes of the one he had so ruthlessly destroyed. Mark Jenkins was charged with first-degree murder. His trial was short. The digital evidence was so overwhelming, his defense was left with nothing. His own words, typed into a search bar in the privacy of his perfect home, were his judge and jury. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community of Maple Creek was left in shock, forced to reconcile the two versions of Mark Jenkins, the charming, loving husband they all knew, and the cold, narcissistic killer he truly was. They had mourned with a monster, and the betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. It's a chilling reminder that the curated lives we see, both online and in person, are often just that, a curation. A carefully selected presentation of the best parts, while the darkness, the debt, and the desperation are kept hidden behind a firewall. Mark Jenkins thought he could control the narrative, that he could design his life like one of his architectural blueprints. But he forgot that every action, every click, every keystroke leaves a trace. He left behind a ghost in the machine, a digital echo of his own evil that ultimately told the whole story. Thank you for joining me in the archives today. The stories we examine here are often dark, but they serve as powerful reminders of the complexities of human nature and the quiet battles that can rage behind a neighbor's closed door. Be sure to subscribe and return for our next entry, as there are always more stories waiting to be told. Until then, be well.